In 1984, American investigators were buried deep inside one of the most baffling murder cases in U.S. history. Young women were vanishing without a trace. Bodies were turning up in forests and along riverbanks, and not a single piece of evidence pointed to who was responsible. The girls disappeared suddenly. The bodies appeared quietly in isolated places, and every time detectives thought they were close, the trail went completely cold. Because the case hit a dead end, investigators did something almost unheard of. They made a deal with one of the most dangerous serial killers in American history, Ted Bundy. A man I've already told you about, a man sitting on death row, waiting to be executed. Detectives offered him a deal. Cooperate with us, and we'll reduce your sentence from execution to life in prison. When he agreed, they spent hours with him, trying to understand how a killer thinks.
How someone can disappear into plain sight for years without ever being caught. Strangely, many of the details Bundy described turned out to be 100% accurate. But the single most disturbing thing he said, the line that changed the entire investigation, was this: a killer almost always returns to the burial site. To make sure the only witness against him is still safely buried underground. That one sentence redirected 20 years worth of failed investigations. It cracked the case wide open. If you're watching this channel for the first time, I'm Amin, the narrator, and I cover everything strange and unexplained on this planet. Before we begin, if this is your first video with us, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. This is a new channel, and your support means everything. Every like, every subscribe helps us keep going. As we always say, every story hits differently when you hear it. It told right. So let's get into it. Today's story is about the strangest serial killer in the history of the United States. A man who lived with his wife for 20 years in the same house, and she never once suspected a thing. She had no idea she was sleeping next to the most dangerous man in America. This story is complex, it's deeply disturbing, and the ending, even more shocking than the beginning. So if this video found you by chance and you don't know us yet, stay with us till the end. You won't regret it. In the early 1980s, the Seattle Police Department began receiving a flood of missing persons reports. Young women, vanishing, no trace left behind. What these women had in common was their social situation. Some had run away from home, some lived on the streets, some existed in conditions most people never see. Because of that, because society had already pushed them to the margins, their disappearances weren't taken seriously at first. People assumed they'd just moved on, left without telling anyone. Nobody pressed for answers. But then, the bodies started appearing, and everything changed. The remains were found near rivers, in dense forests surrounding the city. Young women thrown into remote places with brutal carelessness. And with every new discovery, the terror inside Seattle grew louder and darker. What made it worse was that the police had almost nothing to work with. No real witnesses, no detailed description of the killer, no clear method of selection. The number of victims was rising at a rate that was almost daily, and unlike any serial killer they'd studied before, there was no defined victim profile. He targeted different ages, different appearances, every time a different method, every time a different type of victim. No pattern, no repetition, which made tracking him nearly impossible. You can't predict someone who leaves no footprint. The American press gave this mystery a name that would go down in criminal history: the Green River Killer. The only consistent thread across his crimes was where the bodies ended up, always near the water, always near the forest. And from that moment forward, this case transformed from a string of isolated tragedies into one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. Now, at the exact same time these bodies were being found, a man named Gary was sitting in a therapist's office. These weren't exactly treatment sessions. They were closer to confessional conversations. Gary just needed to talk. But before a single word left his mouth, he did something very specific. He verified the therapist's credentials. He confirmed the doctor-patient confidentiality agreement. He needed absolute certainty that nothing he said would ever leave that room. Under that agreement, a licensed psychiatrist is legally prohibited from disclosing any information about a patient, even if directly ordered to do so. A patient's privacy is protected entirely. Any criminal accusations are a separate legal matter. Once Gary was satisfied the agreement was ironclad, he started talking about his childhood, his mother, his adolescence. And what came out in those sessions painted a picture of a man shaped by chaos and violence from the very beginning. Gary's relationship with his mother was deeply disturbed. He feared her intensely, but at the same time he was pathologically attached to her. The home he grew up in was nothing short of a mental institution. Constant tension, screaming, physical violence. As he got older, three things became central to his psychology: violence, sexuality, and fear. All tangled together, all felt simultaneously. The story that defined him most happened when he was 16 years old. Without any reason, he followed a young child into a forest and attempted to assault and kill him. While he was in the middle of it, Gary was shaking with fear. He wanted desperately to kill the child, and yet he was paralyzed by terror at the same time. The child managed to escape by a miracle. Gary had cried out loud enough that people nearby heard and came running. Feeling exposed, Gary fled. The child survived, and if it weren't for that cry, nobody would ever have known what almost happened there. But here's the question that defines everything. Why was Gary screaming? If fear was consuming him, why was he trying to kill that child in the first place? We will get to the answer, but first we need to understand what the therapist was piecing together from these sessions. After the incident with the child, Gary's life appeared to move on normally. He graduated from high school and enlisted in the U.S. Army. He was deployed to Vietnam, and in Vietnam, fear followed him everywhere. The killing, the violence, it was on a scale that can't be described. He entered relationships with Vietnamese women of questionable reputation. But through all of it, he maintained the same calm, ordinary exterior. To his fellow soldiers, to his friends, to his family, nobody sensed anything wrong. They were just waiting for him to come home. When he returned from the army, he got married, took a job at a truck manufacturing plant, and appeared to live a completely stable life. The people around him saw a simple man, quiet, organized, slightly shy. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. But inside, there was a volcano of evil that even Gary himself couldn't fully explain. He asked his therapist again and again, "Why am I like this?" The psychiatrist reassured him, told him what he was experiencing was understandable, that it would pass with time. But at the end of his file, the therapist wrote a single line that summarizes this entire story. He wrote, "Based on my clinical assessment of Gary Ridgway, I believe I am currently sitting across from a serial killer. He is very likely the Gree and River Killer." The therapist's diagnosis was built on a specific combination of factors: fear merged with revenge, domestic violence, deep psychological disturbance, and a shocking divide between Gary's calm exterior and his buried desire to harm others. When he went to Vietnam, something shifted in him. He developed what psychologists call the management of brutality. His crimes gained a framework, a direction. In Vietnam, the unspoken logic was simple. You want to kill? Fine, but not Americans. Anything else is acceptable. That framework sharpened Gary into something far more dangerous: a professional criminal, a man with structure, with method, with emotional detachment. And his relationships with women of troubled backgrounds? The therapist read those as a psychological pressure valve, a way to release the chaos raging inside him. He was caught between two identities: the ruthless predator with no conscience, and the gentle, quiet man he wished he could be. Based on everything Gary disclosed in that room, the therapist knew, without a single shred of doubt, that the man sitting in front of him was the Green River Killer. But here's the impossible dilemma. The therapist couldn't tell anyone, not a word. If he went to the police and said, "Gary Ridgway is your killer, go get him," the police couldn't legally act on it. And worse, the therapist would lose his license entirely. He would be accused of betraying patient confidentiality, and his entire career would be destroyed. The system would punish the doctor for doing the right thing. The tragic irony is that if this therapist had been able to stop Gary through psychological treatment, through healing him rather than exposing him, he might have saved dozens of lives.
So here's a question I want you to think about and share in the comments. Was the law right? Should the therapist have broken confidentiality to save lives? Or was he right to stay silent? Because whatever your answer is, outside that therapy room, Gary Ridgway was living a completely ordinary life. A steady job, a marriage, an image of a perfectly respectable man. He went to church every Sunday. He volunteered in community activities. He was known as a deeply religious man who read the Bible constantly and wept during sermons. Everyone knew Gary as a devoted, upstanding person. But there was another side to him that almost nobody saw. Violent outbursts that appeared out of nowhere. Sudden, explosive rage. His wife described living with him as inhabiting a silent war zone. He would constantly move his hands and face as though two people were fighting a battle inside his skull. One side, the religious, peaceful Gary. The other, something darker, something without a name. Now, the real question. Was Gary Ridgway actually the Green River Killer? At this point, everything points to yes. But let me surprise you. Because as the victim count continued to climb and the city descended into panic, the Seattle Police Department began receiving hundreds of tips daily. At one point, the number of suspects on their list exceeded 1,700 names, and Gary Ridgway's name was on that list. A witness reported seeing a truck matching Gary's vehicle near the last known location of one of the missing women. Additional tips described a calm, well-dressed man who would offer rides to women walking alone, and the description of his vehicle matched Gary's exactly. Some women who got into the car were never seen again. Some refused and survived. Investigators finally focused on Gary seriously for the first time. They brought him in for questioning. They asked about his movements, his relationships, his life. And Gary sat there, calm, unnervingly calm. No visible panic, no breakdown, no suspicious behavior whatsoever. The detectives threw everything at him, every technique, every psychological tactic, and Gary didn't flinch, not once. The investigators eventually decided to bring out their most powerful tool, the polygraph, the lie detector. Gary agreed immediately, without hesitation. A standard polygraph session for a serious suspect lasts between 20 and 40 minutes. Gary sat in that chair for 4 hours, and throughout every stage of the examination, the machine said he was telling the truth. The investigators were convinced he was their man, but they had zero evidence to prove it. All charges were eventually dropped. Gary walked free. He went back to his daily routine, back to work, back to church, back to being the perfectly ordinary neighbor everyone thought they knew. But what nobody outside that investigation knew was that Gary Ridgway was indeed the Green River Killer. And after walking out of that interrogation room, he didn't stop. He accelerated, because now he knew the police had nothing on him. Not even the lie detector could touch him, which meant as long as he continued operating the same way, he was untouchable. His method of selecting victims was quiet and intelligent. He never used force or pursuit. He used his image, calm, trustworthy, completely non-threatening. He would sometimes place a photo of his son on the dashboard of his car to appear as a devoted father, a family man, safe. That detail alone would dissolve the fear his victims might have felt. A man who loves his family? Surely he's harmless. He specifically targeted women already living at the edges of society, women in difficult circumstances, women who, when they disappeared, nobody would notice for weeks or ever. By the time their bodies were found, decomposition had erased most of the evidence, and Gary was long gone, sitting quietly in church. What made him even more invisible was this: he felt nothing while committing his crimes. No anxiety, no guilt, no internal conflict. A person who doesn't feel tension doesn't make mistakes, and a person who doesn't make mistakes doesn't leave evidence behind. He developed a daily routine. He'd go to work in the morning like any normal person. At night, he'd go out looking for his next victim, find her, take her somewhere isolated, assault her, kill her, and come home. Weeks passed, months passed, the same pattern over and over with nobody noticing a single thing. But then, for investigators, something they'd been waiting for finally started to emerge. A pattern. Because as long as a killer remains unpredictable, he's nearly impossible to catch. But the moment any pattern forms, that's when the net begins to close.
Police began noticing that bodies were consistently appearing in the same general areas, the forests and riverbanks surrounding Seattle. Quiet, isolated, barely monitored locations. As if the killer knew these areas intimately, as if they were his personal geography. And then investigators noticed something even more disturbing. Gary wasn't just dumping bodies and moving on. Evidence suggested he was returning to the sites days or even weeks later, exactly as Ted Bundy had described in that prison interview. Some remains had been moved. Some evidence had mysteriously vanished, as though the killer was deliberately scrambling the timeline to confuse investigators. And it was working. With every new discovery, the forests around Seattle slowly transformed in the public imagination, from peaceful nature into territories of pure horror. People stopped going near any wooded area, ghost zones, off limits. The fear had spread like a disease through the entire city. At this point, the case had completely escaped police control, both in terms of media coverage and public psychology. The entire city of Seattle was living under the shadow of the Green River Killer, and the press and public rumors transformed him into something almost mythological. Some said he was enormous, a former boxer, physically unstoppable. Others claimed he broke into homes. Some even said he wasn't one man, he was a Soviet-backed unit operating undercover. Of course, and here's something worth understanding, notoriety is fuel for a serial killer. The bigger the legend, the bigger the crimes. Some days, Gary killed twice instead of once. The more his name spread, the more invincible he felt. The city collapsed psychologically. Some people couldn't tell you who the current American president was, but they knew every detail about the Green River Killer. Police doubled their patrols. Officers were deployed everywhere at all hours. And yet none of it made a difference. Because all of this, every patrol, every headline, every whispered rumor, Gary was watching from a position of complete calm. At one point, during a community volunteer event with a church youth group, Gary found himself walking alongside a girl who caught his attention. After the event ended, he followed her and killed her. A church volunteer, a public setting. He didn't even bother to change locations. And then, something strange happened right in the middle of all this chaos. The killings suddenly dropped, dramatically. Where there had been 10 victims a month, there was suddenly 1. Then months passed with no killings at all. The police had no idea why. Had he died? Moved to another state? Had he simply decided to stop? For a year and a half, nothing. Complete silence. So what do you think happened? The answer, as strange as it sounds, Gary had fallen in love. He entered a new relationship and married for the 3rd time. His new wife later described their life together as completely normal. He went to work every day without taking a single day off. He came home, handled household tasks, and spent all his time with her. The most disturbing part? Gary stopped killing entirely because of her. He made a decision to live a quiet, stable life, and he committed to it. He actually said, in his own words later, "The strangest irony of the period when I stopped killing was that women who fit my victim profile seemed to appear in front of me constantly, easily accessible every single day, and I chose not to act." His love for his wife had, at least temporarily, switched something off. But psychological experts were clear. The monster hadn't disappeared. It was resting. This was not rehabilitation. This was a pause. Then, science advanced. In the early 1990s, something called DNA analysis entered the world of forensic investigation, a technology capable of identifying the perpetrator of a crime committed 1,000 years ago, if even a trace of biological material remained. In the world of American law enforcement, DNA quickly became the most powerful weapon investigators had ever held. And so, detectives went back to the cold case. They reopened old evidence boxes, hair samples, trace amounts of saliva, tiny biological fragments collected years ago with no clear purpose, now priceless. With the new technology, those fragments could speak. And slowly, one result at a time, Gary Ridgway's name began rising to the surface again. But this time was nothing like the 1980s. This time, the police weren't relying on witness accounts or suspicion. They had direct scientific evidence linking him to the victims. For the first time since this nightmare began, the real identity of the Green River Killer was being proven beyond doubt. And yet, the killings had already stopped. Gary was living a quiet life, attending church almost daily, drawing absolutely no attention to himself. But police weren't going to let this go. They monitored his every move with extraordinary precision. And on November 30th, 2001, they walked into the truck manufacturing plant where Gary worked. In front of everyone. In front of all his co-workers. They arrested Gary Ridgway. The factory floor fell silent. Workers stood frozen in shock as an officer announced, "Gary Ridgway is the Green River Killer." Nobody could believe it. A man who had worked beside them for years without a single incident. His wife even went on record threatening to sue the police department, insisting it was impossible, that the man she loved could never be a monster. But the real shock didn't come from the arrest. It came from what happened in the interrogation room. From the very first session, Gary Ridgway confessed to everything. He spoke quietly, calmly, not a single tear, not a trace of remorse. In the early years of his killing, he had kept a small notebook. He recorded the names and details of his victims. At some point, he forgot to log one, then another, then he stopped entirely, because by then, it had become so routine it barely registered. He told investigators one thing that silenced the entire room. He said, "Sometimes I would dream about a victim and wake up needing to go back to the burial site to confirm she was still dead." In some cases, he would return to the grave just to make sure it hadn't been disturbed. His only concern, that the only witness to his crimes remained buried. Word for word, the exact behavior Ted Bundy had described. The exact thing he'd warned investigators about in that prison deal years earlier. Everything Bundy said in that prison interview, Gary had done it. Every detail, every psychological pattern matched perfectly. Gary also told them something that revealed the depth of his psychology. He said the most vivid sensation he ever experienced, the look in a victim's eyes in the final moment, was something he could never forget, even if he lived 1,000 years. Investigators later confirmed this phrase existed in both Gary Ridgway's confession file and Ted Bundy's, nearly word for word. It proves something chilling. Serial killers, no matter their background, no matter their appearance, they share the same internal language. Gary also said that when the press wrote about him, he felt excitement rather than fear. Their coverage made him push harder, kill more, trying to stay ahead of the law. And the question that remains, how did a man live among people for all those years without raising a single alarm? The answer Gary himself gave was simple and terrifying. He didn't fit the image of a serial killer. No hidden charisma, no genius-level intelligence, no mysterious double life from the movies. Just a factory worker who went to work every day, who chatted with his neighbors, who came home like any ordinary American man. And maybe that is the most terrifying thing in this entire story. The person you trust most, the one who seems the most ordinary, might be the one carrying the darkest secrets. Gary Ridgway confessed to killing 1,058 victims and told investigators the number he'd forgotten was far larger. During the investigation, police excavated approximately 180 bodies from forest burial sites. Most were undocumented immigrants, homeless women, people society had already forgotten. People no one had missed. People no one even knew existed in the community.
Now, back to the question we started with. Why didn't the lie detector catch him? The answer is as disturbing as anything else in this story. Gary's nervous system simply didn't react the way a normal person's would under questioning. His emotional responses were so blunted, so completely deadened, that no anxiety registered when he was asked about his crimes. You were essentially interrogating a man whose brain and body were almost pharmacologically numbed. No spike, no reaction, nothing. He was also, as he admitted openly, completely at peace with any outcome. If they caught him, fine. If they didn't, also fine. He had made peace with every possible consequence of his actions, which is exactly why the machine couldn't touch him. He'd also told investigators, "What I did in America was simply a continuation of what I did in Vietnam. I was trained to kill. There was nothing new about it." Before confessing, Gary negotiated a deal. He told the investigators, "I'll give you everything you want, every detail, every location, every name you'll never find on your own. But in return, no death penalty." He officially confessed to 1,058 killings, but the court only successfully prosecuted 48 of them. Why only 48, given that he revealed the locations of 180 bodies and confessed to over 1,000 murders? That question has never been clearly answered. But in the end, the number doesn't matter. Even if he had killed one person, he would still be a monster. Gary Ridgway was sentenced to more than 1,000 years in prison. No possibility of parole, no good behavior releases, no way out. And here's one final strange detail. To this day, Gary Ridgway remains in prison. And to this day, he remains in contact with the same psychiatrist from the 1980s, the very man who wrote in his file that he believed his patient was the Green River Killer. Those therapy stories were eventually released with Gary's consent. But his therapist says there are still dozens of stories, far darker and stranger, that Gary refuses to allow to be shared publicly. This man has been the subject of countless films, documentaries, and series. He is classified as the strangest serial killer in recorded human history. And that was our story for today. I hope it stayed with you in the way only a story like this can. If you're interested in more stories like this one, I strongly recommend watching the Ted Bundy video. You can't hear Gary's story without also knowing the killer who unknowingly helped expose him. Share your thoughts in the comments. Were the details we covered today real enough? Do you think the American justice system turned this man into a legend larger than his crimes deserved? And if you're new here, this channel is just getting started, and every subscribe, every like, and every share genuinely makes a difference. It's what allows us to keep telling stories like this one. I'm Amin, the narrator. I'll see you in the next video.